Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you? Guys, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
And my screen is also visible, right?
yes,
Okay. Okay. In our last session, we have started discussing data annotation attribute, and we have discussed two important data annotation attribute, that is table and a column. So basically, table data annotation attribute is used to specify, right, what should be the table name in the database and what should be the schema of the table in the database. And using column name attribute, we can specify what should be the column name in the database, what should be the column data type in the database, as well as what should be the column order in the database, right? That is what we have discussed in our last session, not yesterday, on Saturday session. So today we are also going to continue the discussion about data annotation attribute, and we are going to discuss few more data annotation attribute in today's session, right? So let us start understanding, right, by discussing this key attribute in entity framework. So before understanding this key data annotation attribute in entity framework code, let me ask you this question, right? What is the primary key in a database, right? If I ask this question to you guys, what will be your answer? What is a primary key? Anybody having any idea what exactly a primary key in the database?
A key
Yeah.
which
Yeah, one by one. Yeah,
The
anyone?
key which contains unique values and it will not accept null values, and it
Okay,
is used to maintain relationship.
okay, unique plus it will contain not
It will not
duplicate.
contain null values.
Okay, so unique plus not null plus what you are saying? It is basically used to
Relationship.
maintain the
Relationship.
relations. Okay. Any other question answer, guys?
primary key basically creates the non-clustered index when we create on a
Sorry.
particular database table.
What kind of index? What kind of index?
Non-clustered index.
Non-clustered index. Okay. Any more answer, guys?
It will create a cluster index, not a non.
Okay. So as per you, it will create a clustered index. Okay. Anything else? So that's it, right? So basically, right, maintaining the relationship means it is not mandatory, but it is optional, right? Optional in the sense it is not necessary that the right key should be primary key. It can be unique constant or it can be unique key also, right? So if it is a primary key or a unique key, you can maintain the relationship, right? So basically, in simple word, you can say that primary key is the combination of a two constant. So what are the constant? One is unique constant, another one is not null constant. So primary key is the combination of a two constant, that is unique key and a not null. So what do you mean by unique constant? Unique constant means it will only accept unique value into the column on which you apply this right primary key constant. So unique constant means it will only apply unique values. So if it is applying unique value, can we store null value? So what is the meaning of a unique constant? Can anybody tell me what is the meaning of a unique constant?
It
Is it
will not
accept?
allow duplicate values.
So, but is it accept null value? If
Yes.
accept, how many null values?
One.
Okay, so basically, it will unique constant means it will accept null value, but right only one null value. Then what is not null constant means? Not null constant means it will not allow
Null values.
null values, right? So it will not allow null value. So if I apply this primary key constant on a column, then that column neither accept a duplicate value nor accept a null value. That means you cannot insert a duplicate value into that column. You cannot insert what I can say null value into that column. So how is this possible? This is possible because, right, internally it is going to create a unique clustered index, right? Not only clustered, but also it is going to create a unique clustered index, right? So what do you mean by unique clustered? Unique means it is going to accept only unique values, right? And the clustered index means it is going to create on the same table, which is going to determine how the data is going to be stored in the table, right? So for example, if you create the ID column, something ID column of an integer type, and if you insert the record like this, 15423, right? If you insert the data in random order, right, into the table, then once you verify the database, the data is going to be shown in this order, right? The data is going to be in this order. So this unique clustered index going to determine how the data is going to be stored inside the original table. So basically, whenever we create an index, right, that index, so this is nothing but your index. So maintaining this uniqueness, for this uniqueness, it is going to create one index. This index is going to be created on the original table. If it is a non-clustered index, that is going to be created separately inside a right separate table. Index table you can also say that. But for the clustered index, it is going to be created inside your original table, right? And that is going to determine how the data is going to be stored in the database. What should be the order of the data, right? That is going to stored in the database. So as it is determined how the data is going to store, right? What should be the order of the data in the original table? So we can have only one unique clustered index in a table, right? So why? Because that will determine the physical order of the data. So if we are having two index table, let me say, ask you, if I'm having two index table, one is an ID column, another one is on a name column, then how it will determine the data? Integer saying this should be the order, right? Name saying it can be ascending or descending order, right? Based on the character, right? So that is going to be confused. So this is the reason why unique cluster index, right? Only one unique cluster index you can create for a table, and that is going to be created whenever you create a primary key on the table, and that is going to determine what should be the physical order of the data that is going to stored in the table. If you make the primary key, one primary key constant is going to be generated, and that primary key constant is nothing but the combination of two things. One is unique constant, another one is null constant. This unique constant determines that the value should be unique on this column, and this not null constant determines it will not accept null value. So if you create a primary key, then that key is going to be determine how the data is going to be stored in the database. That is the physical order. That the primary key also decide that you cannot insert null value, you cannot insert a duplicate value into this column. And for this primary key, right, it is going to create a unique clustered index. Clear or not?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So now we need to understand this is right, and a table can have only one primary key. Why? If someone asks you why we have only one primary key or why we can create only one clustered index, what should be your answer? Right? We know a table can have only primary key or a table can have only one unique clustered index. But my question is why? Right? Why? What is the reason? If someone asks you, what is the difference between a primary key? You can say, right, one primary key, multiple primary keys. Why we have only one primary key? What is the reason behind for this? Because the primary key is going to create a unique cluster index that will determine the physical order of the data going to be stored in the database. If you are having non-clustered index, those are created separately. There is no relation between, right, your original table where you are storing the data and the index table. Index table is going to be created separate in the case of a non-clustered index, but in the case of a clustered index, it is going to physically determine, right, what should be the order of the data. So we cannot have more than one clustered index. If we have, then we'll only get confused, right? They only get confused how they are going to store the data, right? Whether they should proper, right, follow the right cluster, right, first cluster index, second cluster index, how they will determine. They will only get confused because they are going to physically store the data on the original table. This is the reason why it will not allow us to create more than one primary key, which is not allow us to create more than one unique clustered index, right? Now, what we are going to discuss is we are going to discuss key data annotation attribute. See, by default, if you remember the default convention saying that if you are creating an entity class and if that entity class having this property is called ID, right? So means what? So what it means? It means case insensitive, right? Whatever the right uppercase, lowercase, right, combination of both, right? Whatever you use, if your entity contains these properties or entity class name plus ID, something. Suppose the entity class name is student, and if your right entity contains this property, right, then that property or right will be marked as the primary key. And if you are having combination of both this, right, if you are having this ID property and student ID property, then it will mark this ID as the primary key, right? So this is fine, right? For example, let us first understand, right, the default conventions. Then we will understand, right, how we can make use of key property to decide the primary key. So, okay, let me go to the student entity, right? Let me delete the migration folder. I will start from the scratch, right? This is my student entity. This is my DB context class. You can see it is pointing to EF core DB. And here I need to provide the name as student. So basically in this case, what will happen? It is going to create a table with this name in the database, right? Whatever the DB set property name that you are providing within that name. Now, if you want to, if you don't like this name and you want to provide a different name, you can make use of the table attribute here, and these are the column name that are going to be created in the database. And if you don't like this column name, rather than you want to use a different name for the right database column, then you can make use of a column attribute that we have already discussed, so I'm not going to use them here, right? So in this case, as you can see, this student entity having one property called entity name plus ID, student ID. So this will become the primary key in the table, right? So before proceeding further, let me delete all these things. Okay. So because a migration file will only generated when you do not have any build error. If you are having any build error, then it will not generate it. So once this is done, then open the NuGet Package Manager console, right? Clear the screen, right? What command I need to add? MIG array add migration. Any name you can give, that should not be given earlier. So MIG1 I have given, right? Then what command do we need to update to sync the code base with the database? Update database. So we need to update the database based on our migration file. So if you are having multiple migration file, you want to use a specific migration file, what migration file you want to give here, right? And right, and then you just need to write, and you want to see the right generated code, what SQL statement is generated and executed. You need to give this verbose command. Once you provide this, enter the press button, right? You can see what command are generated, executed, that all these things it is showing into the window, right? Once it is done, go to your database and see if everything is created as not created as expected or not. Open the tables folder, open the students folder, right? Why my student info is there? Okay, that was earlier there. So, no, okay, don't focus this one because this table is all previously created. So that the table is already there. So it is not going to delete, right? Any table if it was available earlier that you can manually delete from here. Okay. So in this case, you can see this is my student ID, and you can see this is created using primary key constant PK. And it is a not null constant, first name and last name. Now, if you go to the keys folder, then you will see that there is a primary key, right? And if you want to see the script, what script it is generated to create the primary key, then it will give you that it is generated on the student ID column, right? It is taking some time to generate the script, right? Once it generates the script, then you will see, right? So it is, you can see it is creating one constant. That constant name is primary key, and this is a clustered index, and it is going to be created on the student ID in ascending order, right? And apart from this, if you expand it, this students, right, you can see it is creating a clustered index, right? So basically, whenever you create the primary key, it is going to create a clustered index, right? So that is what you can see. So primary key is created based on the student ID column, right? And this makes sense. Why? Because that what is the default convention which is followed by entity framework code. You should have one ID column or entity name plus ID column. If both are having, then it will take ID as the priority, right? That is fine. Now, what is my intention? My intention, I don't want any column with the student ID. Rather than I want the name as a registration number, right? Student registration number. So I don't want this student ID. I want to create the primary key on the student registration number. If I mark this as a student registration number, if I create a property with this name, right? Do you think that, right? There should not be any compilation error. That's fine. But whenever you are going to generate the whenever you are going to create the migration, you will get some error. Let's see what error. What error it is saying? It is saying the entity type student require a primary key to be specified. If you intended to use a keyless entity type, call the has no key method in on model creating method. Right. So what exactly is saying? Is saying you should have a primary key, right? If you are intended to create the entity without primary key, please make use of a Fluent API. Please make use of this has no key method on inside the on model creating. So that is what we will discuss once you start discussing Fluent API. We will discuss what is on model creating and how we can make use of Fluent API methods to define all these things. But for now, right? But for now, what is our intention? Our intention is I want to create the student entity where the student registration number should be the primary key. And if that is your intention, right, I don't want this entity to be a keyless. I want this entity to be my primary key. And if you want to do that, then what you need to do, you need to decorate this with the key attribute, right? And this key attribute belongs to system.component model.data annotation. Now, if you go to the definition of this key attribute, then you will see this is a sealed class, means it cannot be derived, and this class having only one parameter less constructor. And what exactly this constructor is going to do denotes one or more properties that uniquely identify an entity, right? So basically it is going to tell that this property is going to be the primary key, right? So and with these changes, now if you run the application, okay, not run the application, generate the right migration file and see whether the migration file is generated or not, right? So migration file is generated. Now update the database, right? So I don't want to use all these things. I just want to update the database. So now you can see build started, build succeeded, and it is applying that migration file to the database. Now, if you come and refresh the students folder, then you will see the name is registration number. The primary key is PK students, which is created on this registration number. And you will also have that cluster index, which is also created on this registration number. Create clear, guys, how to create a primary key, right? And if and this is you need to use when you do when you don't want to follow the default naming conventions, right? So whatever the naming convention required for entity framework or in order to mark that column as the primary key, if you don't need that, rather than you want to follow your own convention, you want to decide what should be the primary key, right, in the database. In that case, you need to use this key data annotation attribute. Is that clear, guys?
Yes, sir.
That is fine, right? How to make composite primary key, right? So composite primary key, suppose I'm having, right, I want to make the student registration number and the student serial number, right? Then you would be intended, right? You might be intended to use something like this. I will mark this and this as the, right, primary key, and this will mark this and this as the composite primary key. Let us first try to run this, try to do this and see what happening. Give me 1 minute. Guys. Let me give this as a 3 and press the enter button, right? So what is saying, the entity type student has multiple properties with the key attribute composite primary keys configured by placing the primary key attribute on the entity type class or by using has key in model creating. So basically, ignore this part. This is belongs to your Fluent API part, that what we will discuss later. But for now, it is saying that you cannot apply this key attribute multiple time with an entity. If you are intended to create a composite primary key, then what you need to do, you need to use this primary key attribute on entity type class. So what it means you cannot apply this key attribute multiple times, right? That is not possible. But if you want, if your intention to create a primary key, composite primary key, then what you need to do? You need to use the primary key attribute. Now, if you go to the definition of a primary key attribute, then you will see these things, right? So it is having one constructor which take at least one property and then additional param string array, right? So whenever you are saying this params means it can accept any number of string, but those are optional. If you want to pass, you can pass. If you don't want to pass, then you can ignore this second parameter. But first parameter is mandatory, right? So you can apply this primary key attribute on already created database table, right? If you cannot apply this primary key attribute on the already created database table, if you try, you will get the following error, right? So basically, what is my intention is, right? Suppose I want to mark this one my primary key, right? So suppose you can see student. Okay, let me copy this as a student registration number, and this is a student serial number. So my intention is I want to mark this registration number and the serial number as my primary key, and already the students table is created in the database. If you are applying this composite primary key on an existing table, then what you will get, let me show you. Add migration code, right? And then what I'm going to do, update the database, right? What is saying, to change the identity property of a column, the column needs to be dropped and recreated. What exactly is saying that? Now he's saying that already you have a table with the primary key which is having the identity column. Now you are just going to create the primary key column on multiple tables. Means the identity is not going to work. This is not going to work. So what you need to do, you need to create a new table. So basically how you can overcome, so simply delete this table and create a new table. Else what you can do is, right, delete the complete database, right? So why we are going to take the risk, right? Even you can delete the table and create the same thing, but here what I'm showing, I'm going to delete this completely. And once I delete this completely, let me delete this migration folder. Yes, migration folder is there, no issue, right? So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to generate this once more, right? CLS migration 5, right? And then I'm going to update the database, right? Again, to change the identity, the column needs to be dropped and recreated. Why it is showing this error again and again? Okay, because of this migration, because of this migration, it is tracking what changes are going to be done. So simply remove the migration folder completely altogether, EF core DB. Let me delete this one also. Okay, now open this one, add migration file one. Now update the database, and you should see the primary key is created as a composite primary key. Now open this one. So basically what it is trying to tell us is, if you already created a database table with one primary key, then you cannot update the same table to have a composite primary key. That is not possible. And in this case, you can see it is creating the primary key on the registration number and the serial number. So whenever we create a primary key based on multiple columns, right, then that primary key is said to be a composite primary key. And you can see this primary key is on the students table, and it is also having this primary key clustered, right, cluster index on the students table. So this is also possible. We can create, right, we can create composite primary key, but you cannot create this one, right? So basically you need to use the primary key attribute to create a composite primary key, but you cannot apply this on an existing entity. So in that case, you need to create a new entity altogether. So how you are going to use? So you need to use this primary key constructor, right? To the constructor, first parameter is nothing but your one of the property name, and later on you can pass any number of parameters separated by comma. So here you can see I'm passing another parameter. You can pass any number of parameters separated by comma. You can pass comma, next parameter, comma, next parameter, but you have to use name of whatever the parameter name you want to provide. That should be the primary key. So this is how you can create composite primary key. Any question, guys? For creating a primary key, you can make use of the key attribute. For making a composite primary key, you can make use of this primary key attribute, right? Even though you can use this primary key attribute to create a normal right key, right? How? You just need to ignore this one. So if you remove this one, then it will mark this as a primary key as well, right? So this is similar to your key attribute, but whenever you are going with composite primary key, that is not possible using the key attribute. For that purpose, you need to make use of this primary key attribute. Clear, guys?
Yes, sir.
Right? If someone asks you what is the difference between a key and a primary key attribute, then you need to tell. Using key attribute and using primary key attribute, we can mark a property as a primary key column in the database. But whenever we are going to create a composite primary key, that is not possible using the key attribute, but that we can achieve using the primary key attribute. That is the only difference between these two. And guys, remember, whenever we are creating the primary key on a single table, whenever we are creating the primary key on a single column, right? And if that column is of integer type, that means if it is a numeric data type in numeric integer type, then the identity column is going to be generated, right? But if that column is not a integer column, then identity column is not going to be generated. For example, I mark this as my key attribute. I mark this as my key attribute, right? So now let me open this one. Okay, it is already identity column, so it is not allowing you to do these changes. So what you need to do, just to delete this one and delete this database, right? And then open this package manager console and again create the migration. Any name you can give if you are creating for the first time, right? Now if you go and check this database, and then you will see it is marking that column as the identity column, right? Open this script to create mode And if you see that primary key column is also going to be the identity column with the value 1 and the 1. See, this is my registration number, and this will also mark as a identity 1 and 1. So the point that you need to remember, identity column is only going to be generated when you are using the key attribute. That means if you are creating the primary key on a single column, and that is true if that column is of type integer. Right. So now you might have a question, sir. Can we create a column on string properties? Right. So as of now, the example whatever we have seen, right? You can see we are creating the primary key on the integer type. So is it mandatory always to be created the primary key as integer type? No, it is not required. It is not mandatory. You can use this primary key on any type, right? Like integer string. So basically we can make use of this as integer or string, right? Now I'm marking this column as a string type. So if I mark this column as string type, do you think that it is going to generate the primary key column on this right property? If yes, do you think that it is going to mark this column as identity column?
No, sir.
No.
Why? Because it is a string property. Identity can only be generated with your integer type. If it is not integer, then you will not see this one, right? So for better understanding, right, what I'm going to tell is, right, okay, as we are going to modify the primary key, as we are going to modify the right identity, so we need to close this database. We need to delete this one. We need to delete the migration folder, and now run the application, and you should see the primary key column on a string property. Migration file, whatever name you want to give, and update the database. Right now, if you go and check the database, then you will see the primary key column is created on the marker, and the size should be 450, the default one. Right? So registration number, it is not on integer type, but it is on marker 450. Again, you will see the primary key constant. Again, you will also see the index args. Right? So basically, if someone asks you, is it mandatory to create the primary key, right, on integer data type? No, you can use any data type, right, which is supported, right? Any .NET supported data type you can use to mark the column as a primary key column, right? So even you can also create a composite primary key like this, right? So in this case, you can also create the composite primary key. In this example, you can see both are string type. It is also possible that one of the type as a string, another type is also going to be integer, right? So example, if I'm showing this one, right? So here you can see I'm making a composite primary key. In this case, the registration number is string, serial number is string. That is possible. You can create. Even it is also possible something like this. So you can create one of the type as a string, another type as integer. That is also possible. Let us run this and see whether it is working or not. Right? So anything is possible. Now let me close this one. Open the package manager console. Right? Right, so anything is possible. Now if you, right, if you check this one, then you will see the primary key column is created as a composite primary key. You can see one key is of type string and another key is of type integer. So that is also possible. Clear, guys? What are the right? If someone asks you, can we create primary key on integer? Yes. Can we create primary key on right string value? Yes. Can we create a composite primary key? Yes. Can we create a composite primary key using two string data type? Yes. Can we create a composite primary key using one string and one integer? Yes, that is also possible. Clear? Or anybody having any question?
So
Yeah, I
one
have a
question.
Yes, yes.
In the Microsoft applications, actually, they are generating a ID, unique ID called GUID. So
Yes, that is GUID. That is nothing but a string value, right? So for example, what I can say, Later I will show you, right? For example, if you don't want this value to be auto-generated, in this case, right, the registration number and the serial number, right, they are not going to be auto-generated, right? So in this case, right, if they are not, right, or not auto-generated means what? They are not identity. If they are not identity, then what it means? It means, right, while you are creating the object, right, you need to provide the value. In this case, do you think that this registration number value is going to be auto-generated? Do you think
No,
that
I
this
mean,
value,
No, we have to supply.
right?
they have the values, and it will combine the value, and it will generate
Right.
the
Let me show you this example. What you are talking about to GUID. Let me example. Okay. So let me apply this as my primary key registration number. And here I have provided this key attribute. As this is a string property. So as it is a string property, so in this case, right, in this case, it is not going to generate the value automatically for us. Later I will show you, right, how you can set the maximum length, right, of this property, right? Next, I need to delete this one, right? Now what I'm doing, I'm using this one, I'm clearing this one, and then updating them on database. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to insert one student entity into the database, right? So for that purpose, what I need to do, first of all, I need to create one student object, right? So inside this student object, what is the first name? First name. Let me give this one. What is the last name? I'm giving this one, right? And then what I'm doing, I'm creating using var db context equals to new ef core db context, right? So I'm creating the context object db context dot r db context dot set changes, and here I'm writing this statement. Student added successful, right? And if you want to see, right, if you want to see the log message, what we need to do? Dot, what is the log, right? Where you want to log the data? Console dot console dot write line. So here I want to log the data, right? Whatever SQL statement generated, that's what I want to see right now. Now run the application. Right? What error it is saying? Unable to track the entity because its primary key property registration number is not. So it is not tracking that entity. You are getting some, I mean, you are getting some exception, right? So it is not tracking that student entity because the primary key value is not. Now, if you see the database, right? And now if you see the database, then you will see the table is there, but there is no data. That record is not being inserted. Now, what is your intention? You want to give a unique value for this column. How you can provide the unique value? So for that purpose, right, we are having this registration number property, right? GUID dot new ID dot toString. So once you provide this one, so throughout your system, this is going to generate a unique value. And that unique value you can store in the database as your primary key column value, right? Now run the application. Exactly the same changes computer routine.
So I think for migration file, you given the
No,
same.
no. That's fine. So you can see the data is being inserted. I'm just looking at the tracking information, right? What information, right? Everything is tracking. Why? Because I'm not provided that log label, right? So you can see the data is inserted into the database, and that's what you can see. This is the This is nothing but 132 digits, right? Unique value. Now, if you run the application multiple times, right? Now, if you run the application multiple times, let me provide the log label. What is that label? What?
Debug.
Information, right? So I'm providing information. So if you don't want these things, right, then you can move this to a namespace using this one, right? So information. Now, if I run this application multiple times, right, then you will see each time you run the application throughout your system, it is going to generate a unique value. You will never find the same value multiple times, right? So you can say this is my insert statement student added successfully. Again, I'm running the application, right? Again, you will see that student added successfully. Again, I'm running the application. Again, you will see that value is going to be unique. Now, if you run the application, then definitely you will see four values, and each value is going to be different, right? This is nothing but your GUID value, matlab global unique identifier. It will throughout your system, right? Throughout your system means throughout this database on this server, right? On this server, how many databases are there? No matter each database, right? For each database, it is going to generate a unique value. Don't think that this value is available in EF4 TP means this right value is also going to available inside my vehicle's API TP. This value is going to be unique throughout this server, right? This is how you need to store. Clear?
Pranay, I'm having actually two questions I'm having.
Give me 1 minute.
Okay.
Ask me, what is your question?
First question is, here we are using the context object in the line number 17 to add the student. Can we use dependency injection? Is there a possibility that we can use dependency injection for that?
Right. So dependency injection for what purpose?
For DB context, like,
Right.
usually.
Yeah, that is possible, right? That is possible, and that is what we are going to discuss whenever we are discussing, right? Entity framework course, SP.NET Core MVC and Web API, right? Because built-in support is provided there, we can register, and through the constructor we can get the context object. That is possible, right?
Okay.
But here but the built-in dependency injection support is not provided here, so we need to manually create this context object.
Okay. And second question is, for example, let us suppose registration number is an integer, then automatically identity is created in the database. Let us assume
Right.
that, let us assume that I wanted to add a reference number that is a combination of my registration number plus some, varchar something. In that case, how we can do that? Like, because I don't know what.
So basically, you need to tell that, right, I'm having one identity column plus I'm having another column where I need to store the data based on some varchar as well as based on that identity column value. Is that your question?
Yeah, combination of some.
So for that purpose, you need to go with right that concept called right. What I can say, right. Dynamically that calculated column, right? That calculated
Yeah.
column concept is there. That is what you need to use, right? And we'll see that those concepts we will see one by one, totally, right? That everything is possible, right? That is
Okay.
also possible. Otherwise, what you can do is, right? Once the data is updated, then you can update the data, right? Once the data is inserted into the database, right? You will get the identity column value, and then you can update that right other property based on your logic, right? For example, if the student in this case, suppose you want to generate this right, for example, if your registration number is there but you are having this ID column is also there, right? So based on this ID, this is one integer type, right? So based on this integer value and some GUID value, you want to specify this one. Then what you need to do, right? In this case, let's assume this is my this value I'm not providing at this time, right? So this is not the right appropriate approach, right? In this case, this value is going to be automatically generated by the system, right?
Yeah.
This value is automatically going to be generated by the system, right? Once you update this, right, automatically that ID value is tracked by this context object, right? So automatically that ID value is tracked by the context object. So what you
Yeah.
can do is you can make use something that registration number is student ID, right? Student dot ID plus, and you can add these things,
Okay.
right? And then
Yeah.
you just need to call this a step changes method, right? That is also possible. If you are not going with the calculated column, then you can go with this approach.
Okay. Then
Right? So
the
here,
database will be
but here you need to make sure first this object should be inserted into the database, and whatever data you got, right? Based on the data, whatever operation you want to do further, that you can do. You can
okay.
update this value within the same table, in a different table, right? But it doesn't make any sense, right? If you are going to this unique value in the same table, doesn't make any sense. Why? Because because this ID column is there, which is going to uniquely identify the database table, database record. Then why you need this unique value again? That is what my question.
Yeah, like I wanted to generate a reference number for each customer, each student, so
Right?
so that I can give that reference number to the student rather than giving my identity key.
Okay, then that you can generate it dynamically.
Mm. Yeah.
Right? That is also possible, right? Then in that case, why not you generate this GUID as a directly, right? Instead of generating an integer, right? Instead of marking this primary key as ID column, why not you make this as the GUID column? And then you can directly return to the customer, right? So in
Yeah.
that case, right, why are you saying this thing? Right, guys? In that case, right? So my question is, if you are making some unnecessary column, then it will be a burden for your database,
Yeah.
right? So why, if the same thing is achieved by using a single column, right? Then why I'm going to create two different column? It is
Right.
not mandatory, right? That the ID column can only be the right integer column can only be the primary key. You can make use of any column like a GUID, right? In my company, right? We are making that GUID as my primary key, right? We are not
Right.
using that ID column,
Yeah. Agree.
right? So it's basically everything is possible, right? In this case also, you will having one unique ID column, and you can having this registration and this registration number, right? Not only this concept, right? Based on the order date, order ID, right? By taking some different combination, you can also create this reference number or whatever number you can say that is also possible. Clear?
Right.
Right. Any more question from anyone, guys? Okay. And this is going to use when entity framework convention doesn't correctly identify your primary key property when working with the existing database where primary key columns might have non-standard names when being explicit about your intention for clarity. So these are the scenarios where you need to go with the key attribute in entity framework core. So this is how you can make use of the key attribute or primary key attribute, right? Next, what we are going to discuss foreign key. So once you understand the primary key, then we need to understand the foreign key. So guys, this is very important, right? Understanding the table attribute, understanding the column, understanding the primary key, right? All these things are very simple. You can easily understand. But understanding, right? People are facing difficulty whenever they are trying to understand the foreign key attribute, right? Anybody having experience on entity framework. I'm not talking about entity framework core. Anybody having an experience with the entity framework 6? Can they explain me what exactly this foreign key attribute, how it exactly work? Anybody? because this is important, right? So developing the application using entity framework or performing the CRUD operation is not a big deal, right? By looking at the internet, by copy pasting the code, you can do the same thing. But understanding the behind scene story is important. How exactly the primary keys are created by convention, how we can modify them, how exactly the foreign keys are created by convention, how we can modify them, right? Those things we need to understand. So, but can anybody tell me why we need foreign keys?
So it is needed to bind two tables to establish a relationship between
Exactly,
multiple tables.
exactly. Exactly. Suppose you want to write, suppose you want to establish a relationship between two database tables, then in that case, you need to create the foreign keys, right? You need to create the foreign keys. And once you establish the relationship between two database tables, then while you are inserting the data in one table, it will check the existence of the same data in other table. For example, you are having one principal table, right, which is storing the gender value with the value 1, 2, 3, means 1 representing male, 2 representing female, 3 representing unknown, right? And whenever you are entering the data in the dependent table, let's say customer table, employee table, and in that table, whenever you are entering the gender value, then then it will check, right? If you establish the primary key and foreign key relationship between that gender table and customer table, then whenever you are entering the data into the dependent table, that is in the customer table, it will check whatever the gender value you are trying to insert, that value is exist in the gender table, or if it exist, then only it will insert the data. Sometimes it will insert null value. That basically depend if your foreign key is a nullable column or not. If your foreign key is a nullable column, then in that case it can accept null value. Rather, or else it will not. If it is a not null column, then it will not accept null value. But whatever value it will accept, that existence it will check in the primary key table. So this is how you need to maintain the relationship, and to implement such kind of relationships, right? Foreign key is mandatory used, and foreign key is nothing but it is a column, right, in a database table that is referred to a column, right, on other table or other table, right? So basically you can say the foreign key refers to the primary key or unique key of other table. So basically, whenever we are going to maintain the relationship, we at least need two database table. One is going to be contain the primary key or a unique key, you can say. Another table is going to contain the foreign key. The table which contains the primary key or unique key, that table we can call as our principal table or principal entity. The table which depends on the principal table or principal entity, right? Or the table which contains the foreign key is said to be the dependent entity. Clear, guys? Right? So principal entity means this is going to represent one side of a relationship, and it can exist independent, right? There is no relation between dependent, right? Principal table can exist, and that principal entity can be right, become the primary key, and many dependent entity can refer to that principal entity. So the table, this is our principal entity, and this is our dependent entity. Let us try to understand this thing practically, right? Once I show you the examples, once I show you the right differences, then you will understand how exactly the foreign key is created, what is the default conventions, right? And then I will show you how you can overcome these conventions, right, by using foreign key attribute. Okay, let me show, right? If you are still having any question, what is principal entity, dependent entity, how exactly the foreign key is created, how exactly the relationship established. Once I give the example, definitely you will understand. Okay, let me first create the standard entity. Go to my entities folder, go to your entities folder, add a new class file with the name standard.cs, right? And then copy paste this code. So this is one of the entity, standard entity. And then I'm going to create the student entity. So student entity, the student entity is already there. So I'm just going to modify the student entity, right? See, let me modify the context class as well. Okay. So this standard entity, you can say this is one end. So whenever you are going to implement the relationship, you need two ends. So this is one end. and this student entity, you can say this is the other end. So at least you need two end. So in order to implement the right relationship, you need navigation property in both of the entities. You need navigation property in both of the entity. So what it means? So whenever I'm saying navigation property, so it can have, right? So it can have, see, whenever I'm saying navigation property, so navigation property means it can be your reference navigation property, or it can be your collection navigation property. So it can be your reference navigation property, or it can be your collection, right? Collection navigation property. It can be your reference and as well as it can be your collection navigation property. So in order to implement the relationship, right? In order to maintain the relationship, both the entities should have both the entities should have navigation property. Both entity must have navigation property. Both entity must have navigation property pointing to other end, pointing to other end. So in this case, pointing to other entity means what? For example, right? If I'm taking the student entity, right? If I'm taking the student entity, if I'm taking the standard entity, then this student entity must have a navigation property. The student entity must have a standard navigation property. If I'm talking about the standard entity, right, it should have a student navigation property. So if these two properties exist, right, then only we can implement the relationship. Right. So basically, if you want to implement the relationship between two entities using entity framework code first approach, then both the entities should have navigation property pointing to the other end of the entity. So if I'm talking about student entity, then this student entity must have a navigation property which should point to standard. If I'm talking about standard entity, then it should have a navigation property pointing to the student entity. If both the entity having the right navigation property pointing to each other, then only we can implement the relationship between these two entities, right? And then the question comes to your mind, sir. Sir, you are saying that is fine, but the thing is that when to use navigation property, when to write. Whenever I'm saying navigation property, it can be a reference navigation property. It can be a collection navigation property, but the question is, what kind of a navigation property I want to implement? What kind of a navigation property I want to implement? Whether I need to go for reference collection property or whether I need to go for collection navigation property. That basically depends which type of a relationship you want to implement. You want to implement one to many? You want to implement many to many? You want to implement one to one? What kind of a relationship you want to implement? Sir, I want to implement one to many relationship. I want to implement one to many relationship. So if you want to implement one to many relationship, then in that case, one student having how many standard? A particular student can belongs to a particular standard only. Then in that case, the student should have a standard reference navigation property. I have created one standard. Then in each standard there can be multiple students. Then in that case, the student, right, the standard should have student collection navigation property. In this case, right, one student belongs to a particular standard representing one to one, and one standard can have multiple students representing many. So in this case, right, in this case, the relationship between the student and standard is going to be one to many. One student belongs to a single standard. One standard can have multiple students. So this is nothing but how you can implement one to many relationship, right? Later in this session, I'm going to discuss one to many relationship. later I will discuss what exactly the relationship, how you can implement one to many, right? Many to many, right? Many to one to one. All these things we are going to discuss in a separate session, right? But today we are going to implement, right? How we can implement one to many relationships. So in this case, right? In this case, right? As the student depend on the standard, so we can say the standard is my principal entity. Standard is my principal entity and student is my dependent entity. So in this example, right, student is my dependent entity. Why? Because standard means the standard is having some properties, right? Standard ID, name, description. Standard ID, name and description. But whenever I'm entering the student information, I need to insert ID, name, right, branch, gender, right, right, and standard ID, right, standard ID. That means in this case, right, see, whenever I'm inserting some data into the standard table, I don't need to check whether what are the students, whatever their ID. I am not the student entity or the student table is not to worry about what, right, the standard table is not worry about the student information because standard is not depending on the student. But whenever I'm inserting the data into the standard table, right, at that time I need to check the standard ID, whether this standard ID, whatever I'm going to insert into my student table, that standard ID is exist in the standard table or not. That means in this case, the student table is depending on the standard table. So as the student table is depending on the standard table, so we can say student is my dependent entity or dependent table. Standard is nothing but my principal entity. And guys, remember, foreign key always going to be created on the dependent entity. The foreign key, whatever I'm going to create, that is always going to be created on the dependent entity. So in this case, this standard ID is going to be my foreign key, which is pointing to the ID column of which table? ID column of standard table, right? Which is pointing to the ID column of standard table. And this ID column in the standard table must be a primary key or foreign, sorry, primary key or unique key, right? So it should contain some unique value. So this is how you can implement. Now, first of all, we need to check both entity must have a navigation property. Go and check. So this is my standard entity. Yes, this standard entity having one collection navigation property means the standard entity having a navigation property. Go and check the student entity. Is the student entity having a navigation property? Yes, the student entity also having a navigation property. And here you need to check the student, as I want to make the relationship between student and standard, the student entity should have a navigation property pointing to the standard entity. Yes, this standard property is pointing to the standard entity. And this standard entity should have a navigation of entity, right? Navigation of property pointing to the student entity. Yes, the student's navigation property pointing to the student entity. And then we need to check what kind of a relationship we want to implement. We want to implement one to many relationship. And this is the reason why you can see student having a single standard and this reference representing it is a one-to-one relationship, and the standard, right, having a particular standard ID can have multiple student, and here you can see it is representing a collection navigation property. So this is how the relationship is established, right? So now in the table, right, now in the database table, how it is going to generate the foreign key. So basically, it will check, right? So whenever, right, this is the standard entity, right? Or you can say this is my principal entity. This is my principal entity, right? This is my principal entity. And this is my dependent entity. This is my dependent entity. And where the foreign key is going to be created? Foreign key is going to be created inside the dependent entity only. So while it is going to generate the foreign key, right? First of all, it will look for the reference navigation property. So is this the reference navigation property? Yes, this is the reference navigation property. So what is the key inside this standard navigation property? The primary key or the unique key is standard ID. So it will check, is there any key is with the same name available inside the student class? Yes, there is the same name is already available. So what he will do, he will mark the standard ID as the foreign key, which is pointing to the standard table primary key or unique key. So in this case, the student ID property, whatever we provided here, that will be created as a foreign key pointing to the standard entity primary key. That is nothing but your ID, student ID. Clear, guys? This is the default convention. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah, clear.
Yes, sir.
Right now. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete this one, right? So as we are going to changing the primary key, all these things, so it's better to delete the database for any unconscious output. Now remove this migration point. Right now. Okay. Give me one background noise. So now we need to add the migration command. Build fail. So why build fail? Because we have written some code in the program class which doesn't exist anymore. So we need to remove these things. Okay. Now again, add the migration. Now this time build successful. Then update the database. Okay, migration file is updated successfully. Now come and check the database. Right? And you can see this is my standard table. This table having only one primary key. And this is my students table. And this students table should have the primary key, no issue. And this standard ID, it becomes the foreign key, which is pointing to the standard table, standard ID column. To check whether it is pointing to the standard table, the standard ID column or not, open the SQL statement, which is generating the students table. And here you can see, this one. It is pointing to the where? Yeah. So this is referencing to the standard table, standard ID column, right? So this is how you can create the foreign key, and this is the default convention, right? Now, what my intention is, right? So I don't want to give this name. So suppose I commented this one, then also it will create the primary key, right? Then also it is going to create the foreign key based on the primary key of this table, right? In this table, we are having the student ID. So our standard ID. So it will check how the foreign key is going to be generated in this case. Now if I execute this program, right? If I run the migration file, so do you think that the foreign key is going to be generated?
Yes.
How it will generate, and what should be the foreign key name?
Standard ID, because it is
And,
pointed to the standard.
okay. So instead of the standard ID, I have provided the name as ID. So in that case, what should be the foreign key name?
ID?
ID. Are you sure? So
Standard
in this
ID.
case,
No, not ID. Should
Standard ID.
standard ID.
standard ID. So basically, if you are creating the property name as student ID, standard ID, that will become the standard ID. If you are only having ID, then entity name plus ID, that will be the foreign key. This is the default conventions. Why? Now see, in this case, I can also create the column name as ID. If this student table having the ID column and this student ID having this ID column, then how it will generate two column with the same name? That is not possible. This is the reason why, right? So it is always going to create, whatever the name plus ID, that is going to be the foreign key. So now, in this case example, even though we have removed this one, it is also going to generate the foreign key with the same one. right? Let me show you these things practically. Migration to update migration, right? So that's fine. Now, if you refresh this thing, then also you will see the same thing, right? Open the table folder and open the student columns, right? Again, you will see the standard ID, right? So this is the default convention which is followed by entity framework code. Clear, guys? Clear
Yes.
or not?
Yes.
Right. Now, what is our intention? We don't want to follow this default convention. We want to provide the right. We want to give the uh, foreign key name as per our wish. Whatever name we want to give. I don't want to give that student ID, right? I don't want to create the foreign key with the name student ID. Rather than I want to give a different name, right? Then in that case, right? In that case, how it is possible? So for to customize the foreign key, right? What do we need to do? We need to use the foreign key attribute data annotation attribute. And if you see this example, right, if you go to the definition, then you will see it is a class having one constructor which is taking the name, right, which is taking the name attribute, and that's it. And this name attribute can be anything, right? So basically, what it means, now you can use this in three different ways, right? You can use this in three different ways, right? How? What are the three different ways? Let us try to understand. Right, so foreign key navigation property name. On the foreign key scalar property, you can apply this inside the foreign key scalar property in the dependent entity. Again, you can apply the related reference navigation property in the dependent entity. You can apply the same on the principal entity. Let us try to understand these three things, right? So let us try to understand these three things, and then I will show you everything, right? So you can apply the foreign key attribute in three different steps. Now, what is my intention? My intention, I don't want to create, right? I don't want to create a standard ID as my, I don't want to create standard ID as my foreign key. I want to create the foreign key as a standard reference ID. Guys, remember, so even though we are going to customize the foreign key property name, the rule is going to be same. Both the entities should have the reference navigation, both have the navigation property. The student property and this standard property must be exist. Without these two property, you can't create the foreign key relationships, right? So now what my intention is, I can apply the foreign key attribute on the scalar property to identify that this property should be the primary, should be the foreign key. How? Now to do this, what we need to do, whichever property you want to make as the foreign key, on that property, you need to apply the standard, right? You need to apply this foreign key attribute. And to this foreign key attribute, whatever the property that representing the relationship, that represent the property that represents the navigation, right? The relationship, that property name you need to pass. In this case, this is my standard property, which is going to make the relationship between student and standard. That property name you need to pass here, right? So in this case, what will happen at runtime, this will tell to the entity framework core, hey, Mr. Entity framework core, please create the foreign key with this name, which is pointing to the standard entity, right? Which is pointing to the standard entity primary key standard is. So point to the standard table standard ID. Please mark this as the foreign key. So in this case, the foreign key is going to be created with this name, right? So to check this thing, let us add the migration file, right? So that's fine. So if you are scaffolding something, there might be some data loss, so that you can ignore and update the database, right? So and once the database is updated, refresh the database and see whether the foreign key is created with the name what we specified in the in our table in our entity or not. Yes, you can see standard reference ID is created as the foreign key. So this is one of the approach, right? This is one of the approach to apply the foreign key. Next, what is next? The other approach is there, foreign key on the reference navigation property. So foreign key on the reference navigation property in the sense, so instead of applying that on the scalar navigation property, which is going to be the foreign key, you can also apply the same here like this. So now it is also going to create the foreign key on this property, right? So with these changes, if you run the application, any question, guys? Anyone, Naresh, saying anything? Okay. So in this case also, it is going to generate the foreign key, right? Now, let me show you this thing practically. Give a different name to your migration file, update the database. So once you update the database, your code file is synced with the database. Now, even though if you refresh, then you will see the same thing, right? The foreign key is going to be created on this column. Now, so this is another approach. The third approach is applying this foreign key attribute, right, directly on the principal entity. So applying this foreign key attribute directly on the principal entity. So how, right? So now what I'm doing, right? Now what I'm doing, this is my student entity. I removed everything, right? I removed everything. By default, in this case, if you run the application, it will create standard reference ID is an integer property, and it will create standard ID as the reference property. So in this case, don't think that this reference ID is going to be the foreign key. In this case, this property will be there inside the student entity. Along with it is going to create a standard ID, which is going to be the foreign key. What my intention? My intention, I want to mark this as a foreign key, but I don't want to do any changes within this student entity. Rather than I want to do the changes on my principal entity. So this is my principal entity. Here, what I need to do, we need to use the foreign key, and here we need to specify what should be the foreign key in the dependent entity. In the dependent entity, if there is any property with this name, please mark that property as the foreign key attribute, right? With these changes, right, to the say, open the package manager console and update the migration, right? So once the migration is operated, execute the database, and you will see the same thing, right? Same thing means again, let me refresh this database. Again, you can see, right, that primary key is there, that student reference ID is there, that's fine. So this is my standard reference ID. Clear, guys? How you can make use of this foreign key attribute? You can apply this foreign key attribute on the scalar property in the dependent entity. You can apply this foreign key attribute on the navigation property on the dependent entity. You can also apply the foreign key attribute on the principal entity navigation property. Clear or not? Yes or no, guys?
Sir, one question.
Yes.
Can we use foreign key attribute multiple different?
So that is what we are going to discuss. Don't worry. How you can apply multiple, right? In this example, you can apply multiple, no issue,
Oh,
right? That is also possible. There is no issue. See, in that case, what is your intention, right? So in this case, this is one entity, and that entity, right? For this standard reference ID is a foreign key which is pointing to the standard entity. You are having another entity, let's say, right? I'm having this instead of standard. Let me say this as a course.
yes.
Right, let me this called as a course. Here I'm applying this course ID, right? Here I'm applying the course name, and this is course description, and this is list of students. So here what my intention is, I want to create course reference ID, another property called course reference ID, course reference ID, and here I'm having one student can belongs to one course, right? Let assume one student belongs to one course, right? So this is course. So in this case, you can see I'm having, and I want to make this course reference ID as my reference key. So you can apply anywhere, right? Here also I can apply, right? And here also I can apply. And then I need to add that course entity here,
Yes.
right? So CO your course, I'm giving the name as giving the pluralized name, CO your SES courses, right? So now open this one, give the name, right? And update the database, right? Now, if you go and check the database, then you should have the three different database table apart from that migration history table, right? So you can see this, and if you open the students, right, then you will see one is standard reference ID, another is course reference ID. Clear?
Yes, sir.
Right? But guys, remember multiple relationship between two entities, right? So in this case, we are implementing relationship between different entities, right? But there is a concept called a multiple relation. Suppose you are having the student and the standard, but you want to implement multiple relationship, one to one, one to many, right? Multiple times. For that case, this concept is not going to work. So for that purpose, we are having something called the inverse property. That is what we are going to discuss later. Right, so now you can understand, right, how you are implementing this. Later I will show you how you can implement one to many, many to many, right, one to one, all these things in detail. But for now, you just need to remember how you can create the foreign keys and what is the default convention, what is the default convention entity framework core follows. And if you don't want to follow that default conventions, rather than you want to create your own convention, right? You want to provide your own right name for the foreign key, then in that case, you need to make use of foreign key attribute. And how to use? For that, you should have the application property between the two entities, depending upon the type of relationship. It can be reference type or it can be application type. And then, you can make use of this foreign key attribute to specify which one is going to be your foreign key. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
Any question related to foreign key?
Hello, sir. If there is
Yes.
a composite primary key in a standard table, then how can
Opposite in the sense? Opposite in the sense?
composite primary key?
Sir, is there any relationship between your composite primary key and the, right, what I can say, these things? Right? So okay, tell me, whenever you are creating the standard table, so do you have that kind of scenario will come, that composite primary key scenario? This
No,
is a
just
master table.
Mhm.
Master table. This is the master table. Master table will never have that composite primary key concept.
Okay.
Right? Whenever you are going to implement the relationship kind of things, right? Then that master table, that city table, that right city master, country master, state master, you do not have such kind of right composite key concept there. And always, guys, try to remove, right? Try to ignore the composite primary key. Composite primary key is not good for performance, right? Because why I'm going to, if I'm going to uniquely identify one entity using a single primary key, why I'm going for the composite primary key? Right? Please try to ignore, right? Please try to reduce the use of a composite primary key until and unless there is such scenario, right? And in this case, right, even though if you are creating a composite primary key, right? So you need to, right, refer to a particular table only, a particular column. And in this case, based on that column value, it is going to check the existence. It doesn't matter whether that is a composite key, right? That is a unique key, that is a primary key, no matter. It is only always, right? Whenever you are creating a reference, reference key or you can say foreign key, it is always pointing to the column of a table. Doesn't matter whether that column is a primary key, is a composite primary key, or it is a unique key. Only one column you can refer, and whenever you are inserting the data, it will check the existence of the data of that column. Clear?
Clear, sir.
Right? So one column you need to specify, and that value, right? Whatever the value exists on that column, that value it is going to check whenever it is inserting into the dependent table. Right. Next, what we are going to discuss, index attribute. So guys, tell me what is the importance of an index in from the database point of view?
Performance to search the
Performance, right? Which kind of operation? It will improve the performance for all the kind of operations or any specific kind of operations.
in case of fetching the data.
So in case of fetching the data, it will improve the performance, right? So the advantages is performance improvement. Right? Performance IMP are right. So the advantages is performance improvement, right? That's fine. When it will use indexes. Right? Suppose you are creating one index. Do you think that whenever you are searching the data or fetching the data from the database, it is always going to use the indexes?
No.
Then when it will use the indexes? Suppose on a table you have created the table contain 20 columns. You have created indexes on 5 columns. Then when it will use the indexes, what indexes it will use? How you will decide whether I need to use the indexes or not?
If you are
If you are fetching the data based on the primary key, then in that case it uses the indexes.
Right? So suppose, but my question is, using primary key, how many indexes I can create?
one,
One
One.
only.
Right? So do you think that that index is always going to be used?
no.
No.
No. Then, no. Then what?
If you
So
have
when it will use the index? That is what my question.
if your data is more in the database,
So if your data is less, then it is not going to use indexes.
yes.
Are you sure?
No, sir. Not sure.
And anybody having any idea who are good at SQL? Okay, let me explain. Okay. So whenever you are going to fetch the data, you are going to fetch the data based on some conditions. Yes or no?
Yeah.
Yeah. So whenever you are using some condition, then in SQL, which clause you are using?
Where clause?
Where clause. In where clause, you need to specify some column name, right? Where, right? Name equals to something like this, right? Some name equals to that palm, right? Or name starts with, right? Or age between, right? So you need to use something called something like this between 10 and 50, something like this or not,
Yes.
right? So basically, whenever you are fetching the data based on the where clause condition, and in the where clause condition, whatever the column name you specified, if on the same column name you are having some indexer, then only it will use the indexer. In this case, if I'm using where name equals to palm, if on the name column indexers we have, then only those indexers will come into the picture. If we are fetching the data like this and we do not have any indexers, we have not created any index on the name column, then indexer will not come into the picture. If indexer will not come into the picture, then what kind of scanning it will do? It will perform a what scan?
Table scan.
Table scan means no index. So what do you mean by table scan?
Can enter table rather than using primary.
Sorry?
It will not set the index. It will set the table directly. It will not use the
Okay.
index in this case.
So it will
It will check the
definitely
entire table.
exactly.
So,
It will check the entire table from the starting to end. Right? It will check whether this is available, that is available or not available. So in that case, right, so it is something like if you are having a book and you do not have the indexes and you want to search a particular content, then what you need to do? You need to check from the starting to the end. Right? Wherever this content, how many times this content available inside this book, that what you need to check one by one each and every page. But if you are having the index, then from the index, you can identify where this content is available, on which pages this content is available. Then you can directly go to the page and you can directly read the content. So the same thing is also here. If you are having an index, then by using the index, right, by using the index, it can directly paste the data from the right table. If you are not having index, then it will make use of a table scan. So table scan, if your right database is very high, right? I mean millions records are present in your table, then definitely it will kill your application performance. Then in that case, you need to use some kind of a right indexers, right? So guys, but guys, remember, don't use indexers, right? Randomly. Randomly in the sense, whichever column, right, that are used frequently in the where class, only create index on those columns, right? If your table having 20 columns and if you create index on all those 20 columns, then also it is going to kill your performance, right? Definitely, whenever you are fetching the data, you will get good performance. But what about the DML operations? Whenever you are going to insert the data, whenever you are going to delete the data, whenever you are going to right, update the data, if you are having multiple indexers, right, then also it is a bad. Then it is also going to make problem for your application, right? So you will get the select operation, the data retrieval operation faster, but on the other hand, right, the DML operations are going to be killed. Why this is happening? Because apart from this primary key, which is created on the original table itself, rest all other tables, right? All other tables are going to be created separately. And whenever you insert a new record, then also it needs to insert that record into the index table. Whenever you are updating some existing data along with the main table, the index tables are also going to be updated with the latest data, with the updated data. This is the reason why it will also impact your DML operations if you are not using the indexers properly. So you need to make a balance between your indexers and between your application performance related to your DML operations, right? Otherwise, we people are going to create indexes for each and every column. We will get a good performance. But again, if you are creating indexes on each and every column, then also it is bad from the DML operations point of view. That is what you need to take care, right? If you are using some column frequently in the where plus condition, then only try to make the index on such columns. Even right, a composite index, or you can say a covering query index, right? That is also good. So what is a composite index or a covering composite index? Composite index means you can suppose in this case, right? Suppose I'm using this one. Suppose I'm using name and age to write name and age, and in the select clause I'm only right. I'm fetching only ID, name, and age. Then you can also write. You can also make use something called the include, right? Make use of something called the include, and in that case you can store this data. That means what? Now in this case, one index is going to be created based on the name and age column, but it includes the data, right? Whatever the data it name age. So if you select query containing this information which is already available within this index, right, then instead of going to the original table, it can also directly return the data from the index table. That is nothing but one concept called covering query, right? That is also possible, and that is only possible whenever we are using something called a composite index. That is what we are also going to discuss, right? Clear, guys? What is index? What is the importance? Right? And if you want to know how exactly indexer work, then just go and check my website, and you will understand what is row ID, what is row lookup, right? When it is using table scan, when it is using index scan, how you will identify whether it is using table scan or index scan, right? All these things I have explained differently, right? Explained in detail, right, in my SQL Server course, right? So you can go and check the same, right? If you go to my website, right, if you go to my website SQL Server, right, then you will see there is something called SQL Server, and inside SQL Server you can say indexes, right? So you can say indexes, clustered index, right? So everything is defined here. What is a table scan, right? What is index tree? What is the balance tree? You need to understand what is balance tree, what is root node, non-leaf node, leaf node, right? How index improves search performance, right? When to right, check whether it is using the table scan, what is the cost, right? How many number of rows are being read, right? everything I'm discussing, right? If you are creating a column, right, on which column you need to create the indexes, right? Right. If you want to have a very good understanding, then you can go and check. Even you can understand how exactly the cluster index work, right? How exactly the cluster index work. That is what I have also explained. So if you want to know, right, all these things, then you can go and check this code, right? But see, indexing is very important, right? Without indexing, you cannot improve your search operation performance, right? Now, if you look at this index attribute, right, then you will see it is a right sealed class. It is a sealed class and having few constructors, and that is two constructor and few properties. Let us try to understand these things practically, right? So practically means, see guys, remember, uh, by default, the cluster index is going to be created on the primary key. We cannot create a cluster index manually using entity framework. So if you are creating any, right, whenever we are creating a table, it is mandatory to be specify the primary key, and whatever the primary key you specify, by default, one cluster index is going to be created. Non-clustered index, we can create separately, right? So for example, okay, let me go and check the, modify this one. This is my student table, right? And inside the student table, what I'm doing here, you can see, this is going to be my primary key. For this primary key, one index is going to be created. What kind of index it should be? It should be a clustered index, right? And for this registration number, one non-clustered index is going to be created, right? How it is going to create a non-clustered index? Because we have specified this index attribute, and here we have specified the property name on which the index should be created. So with these changes, now let me remove these two things. Let me remove this migration folder, right? Let me remove this database. Okay. Then let me open. Okay, there is something called, okay, fine. Open this package manager console. Migration 1. Update the database with our code base. Right. Now, if you go and check, right, then you will see two indexes. Right. Open this table. Right. Go to the database table and go to the indexes folder. And you can see two indexes are there. One is for the primary key, which is a clustered index. Another one is a non-unique, non-clustered index. You can create only one clustered index. So whatever the index which is going to be created automatically whenever we create the primary key, and the rest whatever indexes we created using the index attribute, right? Always those are going to be non-clustered, and that is also going to be non-unique. So means what? It is going to accept a duplicate value. If you want, then also you can make this as a unique index. How? That is what I am going to say. And what is the default naming convention it follows? It follows the naming convention as starting with the IX. IX means this is the default convention, right? And which is representing it's a right index. Then this is nothing but your table name students, and this is nothing but your column name registration number. So this is the index, the registration number index, which is created on the student database table. So you can see two database indexes. Clear how indexes are created, right? So now, instead of giving that name, right, whatever the auto-generated name is coming, IX underscore students underscore registration number, is it possible to give a unique name, right, a user-defined name to your indexes? Yes, that is also possible. How? Let's see. Right, let's see how we can do this. So in this case, what I'm doing, right, I'm providing the index name as index hyphen registration number. And if you see this index attribute, there is a name property, there is a unique property, there is a cluster, right? All these things are available, right? So I'm going to use this name property. So using this name property, I can specify what should be the index name. And in this case, I'm specifying the index name as index hyphen registration number. With these changes, now open the package manager console. add the migration file, then update the migration file to update the database, right? So once this is done, then go and check the, right, refresh this, go to the indexes, and you can see index hyphen registration number. So this is the now the index, right, whatever name we provided with the same name, right, it is creating the index. Clear, guys, how you can provide your own name for the indexers? Yes or no, guys?
Yes, sir.
Right, now what I'm going to show you how you can create index, right, on multiple columns, right? So how you can create an index on multiple columns, let us try to see. So in this case, I want to create one index, right, on the registration number and the roll number property. So you can see I'm providing this registration number, I'm providing this roll number. That means whatever the indexers you want to give, right, that name, right, that property name you need to provide by, right, multiple property by comma separated. You can see I have provided a two indexers and one is for, right. So in this case, it is going to generate one index, but it's going to composite index. So it is going to store both the registration number and roll number, and whatever name you want to provide that name, you can specify something like this. So in this case, one index is going to be generated with the name index registration number, which is going to contain the data of these two columns, right? So with these changes, if you run the, then not run the application, if you generate the migration file, then you will see the same. Update the database, right? That's it. Now let us refresh the database. This is my student table. This is my indexer. Now, if you see the script, then you will see this indexer is created based on the two database columns. You can see the index is created using these two database columns. One is registration number and another one is roll number. And guys, here you need to remember one thing. By default, whatever the data, right, it is going to store, it is going to store the data in ascending order. Later, I will show you how you can store the data in descending order. But now, if you remember, it is going to create the index as a non-unique. Is it possible to create the indexers as a unique indexer? Yes, that is also possible. How? In that case, we need to make use of this each unique property. For example, right, for example, what I need to do is I need to use, right, I need to use the other property. Other property means the sense the way we are using the name property, in the same way we need to use the each unique property. So for example, I'm creating one index on this registration number. I provide the name as this one, and here I'm using each unique true. So each unique true means it is going to be unique index, right? If you go whether the index is unique or not, right? So the default value is not unique, and why? Because if you go to the definition of this method, then you will see, right? It is going to generate, right? It is going to generate, right, the index, it is going to return false. So in that case, it is going to be a, right, what I can say, it is going to be a non-unique index, right? So default implementation code is not provided here. So in that case, you can consider it is going to return false. False means it is going to be non-unique, and that is what you can see at this time. So it is going to be non-unique. Now, if you provide this value as true, means it is going to generate a unique value, unique non-clustered index. To show this, to see this practically, what I'm going to do, I'm going to generate the migration file, and then I'm going to update the database. Right. So once you update the database, go and check whether the indexer is a unique indexer or not. Right. So now you can see the indexer is unique and a non-clustered. Clear, guys, how to create a unique non-clustered index? Clear or not?
Yes. If we don't provide the unique cluster name index, so by default it will generate the name automatically. No.
Sorry, if you
It-
don't provide this name,
Yes. So
then
by
that is what I have to show you now. First, so what the default name is going to be IX and whatever your table name, that is students, and whatever the property name, that is what it is going to follow, right, as the default naming convention.
Okay.
The first example I have shown you in that way,
Okay.
right? So this is the default naming convention, right? Now what I'm going to show you, right? As I show you, by default it is storing the data in ascending order, right? Now, can you define the order of our indexes? Yes, that is also possible. So for example, right, if you don't want right ascending, rather you want to store this registration and roll number in descending order, then what you need to do, you need to use this all descending order and set to this property value to true. Once you set this property value to true, then what it will do, it will store this registration number and roll number data in the index table, not in the original table, in the index table based on the descending order, right? And here I'm not going to give this name, right? In that case, it is also going to generate the default name, right? So let me use that default naming convention here, right? So with these changes now, right, open the package manager console, keep that name as something like MIG5, update the code, update the migration so that the database is also going to be updated. Now refresh this folder, you can see this is my table, and if you go to this, so this is my IX, then students, IX is for index, students is for the database table name, and then the properties name, registration number underscore roll number. And in this case, it is generating non-unique and non-clustered. Why it is non-unique and non-clustered? Because we have not provided that is unique option. If it is not use unique, means by default it is non-unique and non-clustered. Now, if you open this code, right, and now if you verify the script, then you will see it is going to be in descending order, right? The two properties, you can see it is in descending order. Why? Because of this all descending order. Now you might have one question, sir. I don't want all the properties to be in descending order. I want some of the properties to be in ascending order, some of the right properties to be in descending order. Is that possible? Yes, that is also possible. So what you need to do, you need to provide one array with this is descending, right? So you can see I have created an anonymous object, and to this anonymous object, I have specified the first value as false, means this is going to be in ascending order, and this true means this is going to be in descending order. Then you can specify name, whatever name you want to give, and then and if you want to provide that is unique option, then that also you can provide something like this. So in this case, whatever name we have provided, with the same name, it is going to create a unique non-clustered index where the registration number is in ascending order and roll number is in descending order. So with these changes, now open this package manager console, clear this one, then generate the migration file, right? Then update the database, right? Once you update the database, then refresh the students folder, right? So in this case, you can see it is a unique non-clustered index as per our recommendation, and this the index name, whatever name we provided. Now if we script open the script file, then you will see one of the right column data is stored in ascending order while the other one is in descending order. So this is how we can create. Can we create multiple indexes on a table? So yes, that is also possible. How? So you just need to use the index attribute multiple times, right? How? This is how. In this case, you can see one index I have created using the first name and last name property. Another index I have created using the registration number and roll number property. And by default, this is going to create a clustered index. So in this case, once you run this application, then you will see, right, there are three indexes being created on the right. Let me close this one, give this a 7, then update the database. right? So now if you open this one, then you will see there are 3 indexes. Clear, guys?
A non-clustered index, right? Since we have only one
Yeah.
cluster index.
That is the basic rule of a SQL server. You cannot create more than one clustered index. Right? If you try to create more, another clustered index, right, then it will give you error. Right? For example, suppose I want to make this as a clustered index.
Here you have given the index, specify the index on top of the property. That's a non-clustered index only, right?
Sorry. So this index attribute, whatever you are going to use, it is going to create a non-clustered index only.
Non-clustered index. Okay.
The primary key, whatever is there inside your entity, that is going to create the clustered
Clustered
index.
That is only one.
This is the basic rule of what I can say, your SQL server, right? And you can say you can only specify name, right? Unique, ascending or descending. There's no options available, right, to specify whether it is going to be a clustered index or non-clustered index. Why? Because this index attribute is always going to be create a non-clustered index. There is no way you can specify to create a clustered index, and that makes sense because once you create the primary key, that will mark the right. That will create the index. That will create the clustered index. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
And that's it for today. Anybody having any question, they can ask me now. Right, so this indexing concept is very important, right? Because right, what I can say, people do not know how to create index, how to create index on multiple right, multiple index, how to create a composite index, right? And whenever you are working with real-time applications, sometimes you need to improve the performance of some of the queries, and for that purpose you need to create an index. And if you do not know how to create right indexes, then it will not work, right? And in that case, if you are creating the indexes on the database directly on the database, and if you thinking that the indexes should be used whenever I'm running the application code, it will not make use of such indexes. So here you need to create the indexes only, right? The context object should know, right, what indexes it should use. So this is how you can make use of indexes. Any question from anyone related to primary key, foreign key, and indexes, they can ask.
So, sir, we can create the indexes like this also, and we can create the indexes by using the SQL server to read like create index, index name, on and count column and table name. So it's going to be the same.
So whatever, see, in this case, you are using code first approach. Code first approach means only whatever available inside your code that are going to be used. For example, if you create one table here, right? Suppose I am creating one table called my student. Can you access that table using your context object from your code? No, you can't access. Why? Because that is not available inside your DB context class. So this DB context class, right, can only access to whatever your code content, right? And apart from that, if you create one storage procedure here, then don't think that the context object can access that storage procedure.
Right.
Only whatever available within your code base, that what you can access using your right code first approach or using entity framework. If you are having something else, right, some different tables, some different storage procedures, some different indexes, and all these things, you can still access them, but for that you need to use that other concept, right? Raw SQL, right? ADO.NET, Dapper, right? Those things are available for that purpose. Code first approach you are using means whatever available inside your code, those only you can use.
Okay.
Okay. Any more question, guys, from anyone else? Thank you, guys.
Tomorrow we are
Thank you.